So Joel Chandler Harris, he compiled the stories of Uncle Remus, and he did this in 1881. And it's a thing where during this era, as we've spoken about in previous videos when we talk about the Reconstruction era, he was a Reconstructionist, right? So he was very sympathetic towards the plight of like black people and stuff. And so he wrote these stories down as a way of like letting the rest of the country know about the struggles of African Americans, right? So how he got these stories was between the ages of 14 and 18, he lived on a Georgia plantation, yeah? So this is from 1862 to 1866. This is during the Civil War and a little bit afterwards, yeah, during the period of emancipation. So he was on the plantation and he used to go and listen to stories of the African American slaves and getting all these different things, right? So the stories of Brer Rabbit, the stories of Uncle Remus, etc. What these are essentially are basically kind of amalgamation of different West African traditions. So in West Africa, historically, you had different oral traditions, right? And this is how people would pass stories down, because obviously it's kind of in the days before like they had access to writing. So you'd have someone in the village, yeah, called a griot or a jelly, depending on like where like in Africa it was. So this person would be tasked with basically telling the stories of like different things, right? So obviously in West Africa you don't have like rabbits and bears and foxes and stuff, right? But the point is that the kind of archetypal like kind of characters, yeah, in terms of there being a kind of trickster hero, right? You tend to see this quite a lot of in West African culture. So for instance, the stories about Anansi, which are stories which are often spoken about in Jamaica and stuff, right? Anansi the spider, again, is this kind of, it's linked in with this kind of archetypal thing of like a trickster hero. So that ends up in an American context being translated, yeah, by the slaves into here's a fox, here's a rabbit, here's a bear and stuff, right? So all of that kind of explains where these stories came from. And it's a thing where Harris, he ended up being very, very popular and stuff. So much so that within his lifetime, he ended up at a later point being invited to the White House by Teddy Roosevelt. Now, we've spoken about him in previous videos as well. He's very, very progressive for his time, especially on the issue of race. And it's a thing where what he even said, yeah, with regard to Harris, yeah, was this: presidents come and presidents go, but Uncle Remus stays put. So that kind of gives you a bit of an idea of just how influential these stories were in America at the time. So now talk about how these stories end up being put into the context of becoming a Disney film is a thing where Walt Disney, from as early as 1938, basically bought the rights for this. Yeah, so he went to the Harris household and basically like spoke to his family, and he managed to buy the book for $10,000, right, which in today's money would be almost $200,000. So it's a bit better a deal than the deal that people who wrote Bambi and Dumbo got. We've spoken on that in previous videos. But it doesn't really make up for the fact that by 1986, the film had earned over $300 million, right? So it's a good deal, but it's not really a good deal, right, in the grand scheme of things. So anyway, like we said, he bought the rights to the story in 1938. And then in 1939, this is where he began the developing for the story. So who he got to write the storyboard, yeah, was a certain Dalton Raymond, right? So he was a Southerner, and obviously it's a thing where Disney wanted it to be written by a Southerner. However, it's a thing where he's a white Southerner, and these stories here are about black Southerners, and obviously we'll talk about this a little bit later, but it's a thing where obviously how a white Southerner and a black Southerner in those days are going to perceive things is going to be very, very different. And so it was a thing where to try and balance this out, it was a thing where Disney brought in Clarence Muse. So he was an actor and also he was a script writer. And the idea was basically that there would be a bit more of a balance, yeah, between this kind of white Southerner's view and this black Southerner's view of what the situation would be. But Clarence Muse ended up quitting the project, yeah, because Raymond wouldn't take on board any of his criticisms. And it's a thing where Disney in later years tried to kind of like downplay it and basically say the reason why he left is basically because he was salty because he didn't get the role as Uncle Remus. But that's not probably the case. It's probably more this thing here of being ignored and stuff, right? Especially when being brought in on this project, yeah, to balance things out. To work on the project didn't start until 1944, and it's a thing where Disney still wanted it to be balanced out, yeah, because just having a Raymond write it, it would still have too much of a white Southern slant. So what he decided to do is to have an actual screenwriter, because I've got to say as well, Raymond had never and would never write another script other than Song of the South. And so they got someone who was A, more kind of experienced, but B, also someone who balanced out the kind of like nature of Raymond, right? So who they got instead was Maurice Rapf. So Maurice Rapf, he was a Northern Jew who also happened to be a communist. So he ended up getting in trouble a bit later on with regard to the whole McCarthy era thing. So the idea was having this Northern Jew and like this Southern white guy writing the script. So the script that Raymond wrote had a lot of racial overtures, right? So the black people saying massa, which means like master, the white characters in it referring to darkies. So it's quite explicit, kind of on the nose thing. And also as well, it was a thing where how he kind of wrote it, it still implied that it was kind of an antebellum story, right? So it was a story where it would be set in the time of slavery, right? So the black people would be slaves. So in contrast to this, Rapf wanted it to be very much set in the era of Reconstruction. And he wanted that to be very clearly said, yeah, that kind of like, we're freedmen, I ain't got no master, all these kind of things here, yeah, right? So the constant clashing between these two visions end up leading to the Song of the South being very much a compromised film. And the thing is, we'll talk about this a little bit later in terms of the themes and history, but the thing is that at the time, America was very much divided on this issue of race. So it was very hard to please anyone with this, and so they end up having to have a compromise between the different competing visions. So for instance, the NAACP were very, very annoyed because they didn't end up getting a treatment for the film, which had been denied to them. But then also as well, other people, like especially from the South, were complaining about how the black people were being like depicted with the white people in such close proximity during an era of segregation. So lots of politics, lots of kind of like messiness with this, but eventually the script ended up coming out, which was a kind of as good of a compromise as they likely could have made. So talk about the story of the studio, right? So it was a thing where in the early days, what Walt wanted was for the entire film to be animated. However, during this time, like we said before, you had budget cuts because of like the fall in revenue from different films. You also had the war. You also had like the Disney animated strike. All these things was kind of happening. So the film ended up being shelved, for many, many years. And also it was a thing where it was decided that they'd strip back on the amount of the film that was animated. So instead of it being a feature-length film that was going to be animated, instead only a third of the film was going to be animated, and the rest of it would be a live action. So with regard to all of this, this is where like the casting comes in, right? So originally, Uncle Remus was going to be played by Paul Robeson. So Paul Robeson, he was a singer, he was an actor, he was involved in many, many different things, and also he was quite a big political activist and stuff, right? And it's a thing where Walt Disney in 1941 met with him and kind of, they discussed the idea for the film stuff. But more likely than not, what ended up happening is because Paul Robeson, again, a communist and stuff, right, his politics probably got in the way of him getting this role. So instead, the person who ended up being picked is someone who had worked with Disney before, but hadn't actually kind of met with him because, like, his role was quite minor. And this was James Baskett. So James Baskett, he had been Fats Crow in Dumbo. So we've covered that in the previous video, talk about Dumbo. But it's the thing where he originally just applied to be one of the talking animals in the thing. He didn't expect to kind of ever get like the lead role. But it was a thing where Walt Disney heard his voice and thought, you know what, he would be perfect as the role as Uncle Remus. So he ended up being picked for that role. Then in terms of the actor who played Johnny, this was Robert Driscoll. So he would later go on to be in Disney's Treasure Island, and also he'd be the voice of Peter Pan in 1953, one of Peter Pan. So we'll talk more about him as an actor in that video, but for now, just know that he was in these two films. And then also you had Ginny, who's played by Luana Patton. She wasn't in any other kind of major films or anything. You had Ruth Warwick, who was in Citizen Kane, and she played Miss Sally. You had Nick Stewart, who played Specs Crow in Dumbo, and he is the voice of Brer Bear. You have Johnny Lee, who is the voice of Brer Rabbit. He's not really anything too notable. And then, of course, you have Hattie McDaniel, and she was very famous in Gone with the Wind. We'll talk about that a little bit later on, but yeah, so she was a major character in that. So that explains the kind of like casting of the thing, right? And we talk about the kind of the story of the studio. But now we're going to dive into the themes and the history of the Song of the South. And it obviously gets quite controversial, but yeah, that's what we're going to go into now. So talking about the kind of like notable themes and history of A Song of the South. So obviously the main kind of like theme that they have is one of the story being put in a kind of thing of like fables, right? So a fable is a story which has a moral in it, right? So morals is obviously life lessons within the story. So each of the stories, although obviously, as it says at the beginning, yeah, it's talking about critters, right? It's very much like Aesop's fables, where although the things are happening to animals, it's a thing where you as a human being can still get those life lessons. And even though it might be aimed towards children, it still is a thing where it's a universal thing. It's a thing where any adult, any person can get life lessons from this, right? So that's kind of one kind of theme from it. Another theme is kind of friendship, right? But friendship that crosses different societal norms. So if you think about someone like Johnny, for instance, right? At the time, someone like him, who's a white, rich, southern boy, more likely than not, he would never be friends with a girl. He'd never be friends with someone from a lower class. He'd never be friends with a black person. But within the film, quite naturally, he's friends with, Ginny, who's a poor white girl. He's friends with Toby, who's a poor black boy. And also, of course, with Uncle Remus, right? So in many ways, it kind of like crosses a lot of these kind of like boundaries, right? And even at the time when the film came out in 1946, these boundaries were still very much in place. Like kind of boys didn't tend to play with girls. White people, even up until the 1990s, yeah, in many places, white people and black people were, they didn't like live together. They didn't tend to interact with each other in any kind of like positive way at all. And yet on screen, you see quite a natural friendship. There's not a kind of like hierarchy of anything. He doesn't try and boss anyone about. It's like a genuine kind of like friendship, which is kind of being shown on screen. So it's very progressive, especially for its time. But of course, the big elephant in the room is the theme of race, right? And there's no kind of getting away from it. The fact as well that because like we said, it was like this kind of compromise between the two things. It's a thing where whichever way you look at it, it was going to annoy people, right? As a matter of fact, it's the thing where one of the publicists for Disney is Vern Caldwell. He actually wrote a letter to Percy Pierce, who we discussed in the last video, and he said this, right? Between the Negro haters and the Negro lovers, there are many chances to run afoul. So the point being, like we said, it's a thing where it's the 1940s, right? You've got segregation in the South. It's a thing where black people don't have any voting rights in many places. They're disenfranchised. There's segregation everywhere in the schools, in like public places, everything, right? So with that being the case, it's a thing where you're going to have black people like in like the NAACP who are going to critique the kind of racial stereotypes within this, yeah, of like how the black people are portrayed. On the flip side, you're also going to have a lot of like white southerners who are going to be like, why are these white and black people like kind of like mixing with each other in this kind of like friendly and like close way and stuff, right? So it's a thing where no matter how the film was going to come out at that time, it's a thing where it was going to be controversial to have these things on screen. However, we have to look at this not through kind of 21st century eyes, as often people do. We have to look at this in terms of 1946 vibes, right? And we have to actually understand that for the time, in spite of the criticism that it was actually very progressive, yeah, for its time. Because people in those days, there weren't that many roles where black people would be portrayed. And so the only times when it was really showed was in the setting of slavery. You see this again with Gone with the Wind, which we'll talk about in a little bit, but it's a thing where, yeah, it's difficult, but the thing is, it's given what America was at the time, it would have been difficult to have made a film which would have been more progressive than what the Song of the South was. It would, so as much as we wouldn't like it, and as much as people at the time didn't like it, it was a thing of realistically, like this was the best that could have been done at the time. It's very controversial to say that, but yeah. And it's also a thing where because they didn't kind of make it explicit, yeah, that it was in the Reconstruction era, even me today, I filmed this, I did the research for it today, until today when I was filming this, I didn't know that it was based in the Reconstruction era. I'd always watched it assuming that they were slaves. So I can't remember what board it was, but like there was a board that was in charge of like film stuff. I'll have it on screen now. But they actually advised that the film at the start of it should say it's set in 1870, because then it'd be clear that it's like post-slavery and stuff. But for whatever reason, this wasn't included. And so you watch the whole film being like, are they slaves? Are they not slaves? It's kind of an open air thing. And that's probably why it got so much criticism, right? Something which had originally meant to be something which was progressive and showed like black people in a positive light, end up being something which was tainted and end up being kind of it's tied in with the kind of like lost cause myth, yeah, which was often believed by a lot of like Southerners, yeah, which was like the idea that slavery was good for the slaves, like slaves and masters like got on with each other. The Civil War wasn't about slavery; it was a war of northern aggression trying to interfere with like the Southern way of life and stuff. And yeah, it's all kind of tied in a very ugly way with that. If you made it clear that it was a Reconstruction era film, it probably would have got less criticism, yeah, because it would have been, but instead, because you're thinking the whole time that it's set in slavery times, you're thinking the master and the slave here are a bit too close to each other and this kind of, it's just not good, right? But is a thing where actually people in those days seeing black people on screen in roles where they're likable characters, where they're main characters, again, it's a thing where in a world where most white Americans would never have seen any black people, or any black people that they would have seen, they would have had a like preconceived like notion of them, of what they were like. Having these black characters in films like this at the time, I would argue actually did quite a lot to improve race relations, because it broke down those racial barriers and stuff. Yeah, that's my personal take. If you kind of look enough at the history of it, I think that that's kind of the take that people would have for it. For instance, when we're talking now about the kind of legacy of the film,